we had our first Team Westport book group with the goal really of educating ourselves on the history in the United States of inequity, and really wanting to educate ourselves on how there has just our history of racism in this country. And so we made a commitment to reading books together and having discussions and educating ourselves. And we're really excited that tonight, this is the first of our collaboration with the library. And so we hope to do this moving forward on a monthly, bi-monthly basis. And we were hoping to be in person, but here we are. And so we might be having a few of these virtual book groups in the upcoming months. We've got a great turnout, so we're really excited about that. And so just a couple ground rules so that we can have a really interactive, but sort of collaborative discussion. We are going to open it, everybody, we would like people to hear everybody's voice tonight, but we are also want to give space for different people to talk. So a couple things is, when you are not speaking, if you could mute yourself, just makes it, there'll be less background noise. We're going to have 5 members of Team Westport facilitate the conversation by asking questions and offering some of their reflections. If you would like to, if you have a question or would like to answer the question, please in the chat, you can either raise your hand and when there's a little break in conversation, I will call on you, or unmute yourself and ask the question. And if you have a particular question that you want to address that any of the team members have spoken to, please just write it in the chat. So we'll get some of the questions from the chat, but then we of course want to hear your voice when you're called upon. And that's, again, in a real life situation, we wouldn't have to do all of the hand raising, but we do now. Let me see, anything else? I think that is it for now. So now I want to introduce Harold Bailey, who is the chair of Team Westport.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. I appreciate it. And I also want to welcome everyone tonight. While this could be a one-off, I think we're going to be in this kind of a format for some time to come. And it may turn out that this is more of an optimal format than actually being in person. So we'll see. We'll see. Well, what I'm going to do right now is just to introduce the facilitators / participants tonight, who we're kind of calling participators, who are members of Team Westport. First, Bernstein McLeod Bailey, who is Secretary of Team Westport. She's President and founder of McLeod Associates. She's the chair of the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community in Bridgeport. And she's also the past president of the Links Incorporated for Fairfield County. And she served on the Brown University, Fairfield County Community Foundation, the Westport Library, and Mid-Fairfield County Dress for Success. Bernstein. We have Ramin Ganeshram. Is Ramin here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, sorry, I didn't. See, this is what happens. Okay, glad you're here. Ramin is the executive director of Westport Museum. And as that director, she's garnered regional, state, and national recognition under her leadership for the museum. She is also a very noted author, and very excellent one, and a historical researcher as well. Dr. Judith Hamer is joining us. She's a 37-year resident of the area. She has raised 3 daughters here in Westport, 2 of whom are joining us tonight. She's an author and a retired educator who's taught at City College in New York, Columbia, and NYU, as well as one who's managed education programs at UBS and the Rockefeller Foundation. Next is Reverend Alison Patton, who has been with us for I guess it's 8 years now as of this month. And is pastor at Saugatuck Congregational Church, and has been an absolute mainstay with respect to the conversation initiatives and our community discussions inside of Team Westport. She's also a leader of the Westport West and Interfaith Clergy, and has been our representative to that and a number of other, I guess also to the interfaith clergy, Westport West and Interfaith Clergy for us as well. And our moderator, who is Catherine Lewis, is a licensed clinical social worker with the Ackerman Institute for the Family in New York City. She is also a licensed therapist here in Westport and New York, where she provides services for individuals, couples, and families. And another mainstay is co-leader of the Team Westport School Subcommittee. So we're gonna go to each one of our participators and have them kick things off with a discussion.
Carol, you have two more. You have Zoe and me.
Whoa, who am I missing?
Zoe and Susan, we're both here.
Yeah, no, I was just introducing the participators tonight in this discussion. Zoe's not.
I thought you were Zoe's. I thought you were introducing Team Westport. No.
No.
Okay.
No, we have even more than that.
Well, I know, but I mean here.
No, I mean we have even more than that here.
Oh. I didn't see that, but I saw Zoe.
Okay, no, Zoe's not going to be a participant tonight. So, okay. I mean, if you want to, I mean, that's what we're
right.
doing.
I don't know what a participant is then, I guess.
Okay, a participant is someone who is going to help us kick off the discussion tonight with a specific question that they're going to take. We have 5 people who are going to be doing that tonight, 5 people I just introduced. And then they'll kick it off with a question, their commentary on that based on the book, and then we'll open it up for discussion as we go along. Each one will do that, and then we'll have open Q&A following that input. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, okay, yes. Great. And again, what we're asking is if you are not doing the discussing or the leading, or you're not talking, to please mute. So we're going to kick things off with Judy.
Oops, I can't hear you.
You're on.
Right, okay. This has been a very thoughtful book for me. And I thought that the best way to talk about my reactions to it, is to cite times in my life when I have been an anti-racist and when I have been a racist, because that's what Kendi is wrestling with. And I didn't realize that I had been thinking about it until he gave me the words to think about it. So let me give you some examples. And then those of you, whoever has read or not read the book, can deduce what he's talking about. So, times when I have been a racist. And I've got to tell you, these times have happened very recently. I took a DNA test probably 2 or 3 years ago. The results came back in general, 25% from the United Kingdom, and the rest, 75% from various regions in Africa. So we get into a discussion at Meadow Ridge, the retirement community where I live. We get into a dinner discussion and everyone is talking about their backgrounds. And I say, oh, 25% of my DNA comes from the United Kingdom. I'm 25% white, y'all. Now, you know something? That's a racist position because I didn't mention the other 75%. And I felt uncomfortable about it, but I did it anyway, and I didn't know why I had done it. Okay, much more recent reaction that Kendi talks about at the end of his book. And that is our ability to admit failure. This past Black History Month, I chose four films by Black directors to show at Meadow Ridge. I showed one each Wednesday of Black History Month. And I of course, saw the films again, worked on who the directors were, thought about the cast, thought about the narrative flow, did all of that, got up and talked about it in the auditorium in front of many of the residents of Meadow Ridge. And I thought, okay, now I have done my piece. I've introduced Black films to Meadow Ridge. Now, since the pandemic, they have showed at least 5 films every week. You know what? None of them was Black. Not one. No Black actors, no Black directors, no Black characters. So I am at the point where I can do one of two things, according to Kendi. I can sit back and say, oh my God, those whites, they're just racist. I might as well just give up. Or I can admit that I have failed in what I was trying to do. Now, insanity is repeating the same thing and expecting different results. So if I admit that what I wanted to happen didn't work, and it's not necessarily because all of the white people here are racists, then I've got to think about how else are you going to get your point across? Are you going to build some coalitions? Are you going to do something different? Are you going to say specifically, repeatedly, and loudly, hey, we want a place at the table? I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do. But it was easier for me just to dismiss the lack of response as they're a bunch of racists. I always knew it, and this is proof of it. That's how I've been a racist, and I'm working on that. How have I been an anti-racist? One of the things that Kendi talked about he gave a very strong defense of Ebonics or Black English. Now, I find it really interesting that when he was about 6 years old, I was teaching a course in Black English at Columbia University. And I was teaching it because I was absolutely convinced that the way that a number of Black people talk is not inferior, it's not substandard English, it's not non-standard English, it is a different English. And I found the research to prove it. And I ran a couple of semesters courses for teachers of language arts, speech, and reading, because I wanted to get across the fact that they were dealing with a different language, not a negative language. The language has its roots in West African grammar. So it's different. And the teacher's job is not to blame the kids for being stupid. The teacher's job is to understand the background and help them make a distinction between the language that they speak on the street and at home and the language that they need to master for school. So that's one thing that I've done as an anti-racist. The other thing, and I think you're beginning to see what a mixed bag this is. Again, at Meadow Ridge, I joined a group that gives out scholarships for post-secondary education. It gives out scholarships for Meadow Ridge staff and dependents of staff. When I joined that group, only servers in the dining room were getting those scholarships, and they were all white. So I immediately got angry. Then I looked at the bylaws and saw that it doesn't have to be college education. It only has to be post-secondary education. When I talked to people about it, about why no Black people were applying, no Latinx people were applying, although we have a housekeeping staff, we have a maintenance staff, we've got a kitchen staff, and I know that those people are of color. The people on the committee said, oh, they're not interested. Oh, they don't have time to go to school because they're taking care of kids. Or nobody applies for this. So if they don't apply, can't give them a scholarship if they're not going to apply. And I figured, I know why they're not applying, because every year you pass out these scholarships and every year they're all white. And so the very subtle message is, this is for whites only, although you say it's for everybody. But who's everybody? So I went around to every single department meeting, whether they were at 7 a.m. in the morning or 10 p.m. at night, because there are shifts here. And I said, hey, y'all, you know what? These scholarships are available to you. And you ought to think about it. Now, of course, I was playing on my appearance, because I knew as soon as I turned up and said, listen, I'm telling you that they're available, people would get the message. I didn't need to say that who they're available to. And the population has turned around, population for the scholarships and for the awards. So those are just the recent things in my life that I've done to be an anti-racist. But it's hard deciding that it's painful deciding that some of the things that you've done have not contributed to equity. And some of the things that you've done have. And I need to think about it. So I'm thinking about it. And I thank Dr. Kendi for forcing me to think about it.
So I'm wondering if we could maybe open it up to anybody who'd like to speak on this. In terms of this idea that there's times you can be racist and anti-racist. I'm wondering if folks had a reaction to this, an opinion. What does it mean to have to constantly reaffirm your identity as an anti-racist? Is there any benefit to the fact that you can't just decide you are not racist or an anti-racist and be done with it?
I have a question or a comment.
Mm-hmm.
That's me. I'm struggling with this, the idea of when can you make a difference and when can't you, There's a flag in Southport at Spick and Span Market right now. That's the black and white American flag with a thin blue line, ostensibly for law enforcement, but very much, in my opinion, a very unwelcoming symbol of hate. And I'm so upset about it that I do something, and I am so overwhelmed by the futility of things right now that I find myself crying and not doing. And so when you were speaking about feeling like a failure because of the lack of response to your movies, it really resonates with me in terms of just I don't know where that falls within what I've read in the book, which I agree, the language in this book, like a lot like Between the World and Me, was really helpful for me, continues to be really helpful for me. I appreciate language. that I can use. But I don't know where that puts me, you know, in terms of those two categories. My inability to know or to pull up the energy to do something when I feel like I already know what's going to happen.
What do you think is going to happen?
They'll explain it away.
But you don't know that yet.
No, and then I think I'll write a letter. No, I should go in, you know, and just think, how could anyone, I guess I'm paralyzed by how could anyone not realize what they're doing, especially this past week, especially right now, especially anytime, you know, and then I feel stupid for expecting something different.
So can I ask you a question? So the first thing I thought of when you said that was I thought I could understand why you wouldn't say something now, because it is a very, right now, first responders, people seen as first responders are seen as heroes for many rightful purposes as well, right? And we need to be appreciative of what they're doing in this pandemic. I think, you know, obviously not people who are breaking the law and doing wrong things, racist things. So my first thought was, I could see if legitimately you felt this isn't the time to say something because of aggression toward you or your family, right? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm asking you, is that part of it? Because I think Kendi also speaks about that, like fear and courage, but that's not it.
No, not at all.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, but good question. And I'm not doing anything. I guess I'm kind of measuring the room, like, I don't know. But in the context of this, it's which category does this put me in this moment?
Yeah, I don't think any of us has a hard and fast answer, because it is so difficult. And that's why books like this one need to be written and read and reread and reread. And when I was rereading it, I found that there were things that I didn't catch as deeply the first time, right? And then I read things and I thought, I got that the first time and now I'm confused. So, you know, I don't think there's an answer. I think the fact that you're thinking about it is a really good step on that path to being an anti-racist in this moment more of the time than having racist ideology, right?
I really wouldn't worry. I wouldn't worry as much about whether you are on the right side of anti-racist or racist. This is kind of on the line, and it's got to make sense for you personally to go do this. And I know you said you're not concerned about your safety, but this is a very volatile time right now.
It is a volatile time. I hadn't considered it. Yeah.
So if you're talking about, especially if you're talking about the police force, I mean, be careful and think carefully. The whole idea was not to risk your own personal safety to go do something, but to make a point when it's something that is going to make a difference, or if you think it's an outrageous, egregious thing, and you can get some response that's going to be something other than vitriol back.
Right. What I've been doing is talking to other people who may not have noticed it, to just raise awareness. And that's, you know, so far that makes sense to me.
Makes a lot of sense. Sure.
Well, I hadn't even considered that. Yeah, you bring up some good points, but
you gotta think black. Yeah. Let's get real, people. Come on.
I'm gonna mute myself now.
Okay. Okay.
Harold,
Can I make a comment? Oh.
Yeah, maybe one more
this
and then we'll move on to Harold's question. Yep.
Oh, this is Jill. So I didn't read the book. I'm here because my mom is on here, quite frankly, and I wanted to meet all of you. So I live in Harlem, and it's very gentrified. So it's mixed. It's black and it's white now. And I exercise regularly at this park, and I still do. I see police cars in the park. And up until a week ago, when I saw the cops and if their window was rolled down, I'd say thank you, like thank you for your service. But then a couple of days ago, I saw some video about these cops just basically radically enforcing the distancing laws in Brooklyn. And they basically just like took down this black guy, like just mercilessly. And, and then they also did some subsequent reports about the enforcement, like white people in parks weren't social distancing, it was fine, but the black folks were, being arrested and whatever. So all that happened. So then, starting a couple of days ago, when I see those cops in their car when in the park, I don't say anything to them. I just keep going. So that's an example of my racist and anti-racist. And I know, when I walk by, I'm like, you're walking by, you're not thanking them for their service, you're not thanking them for basically risking their lives because now you see them as racist. And it's not something that's happened to me personally, but it's something that's happened to someone who looks like me.
Harold, do you want to speak to that? You're just because you're also up next.
Yeah, I'm up next, and that happens to be my subject.
Yeah,
which is COVID impact on Black and brown people. I mean, we're talking about disparity now, and so when I want to go back, I mean, I could throw there's that's going on. The most tragic piece is obviously the death disparity that's going on. We talk about representation. If we take the percentage of the populations in New York, Louisiana, and South Carolina, Black people are represented. The death rate, the percentage of people who have died is twice the representation in the population for Black people in New York, LA, South Carolina. It's 3 times in Michigan and Missouri. It's 5 times in Wisconsin. And if we go back to the basics of what Kendi talks about, the bottom line, the first thing is there are just as many people in any group, any large group of people, like all the Black people in the country, all the Asian Americans in the country, all the white people in the country. You're going to find just as many people who are geniuses on a representative basis, just as many people who are not that bright, just as many people who are boring, just as many people who are funny. You're going to get pretty much equal representation across the board. That's the idea. Because they're just people who happen to look a little bit different from each other. So his point is, if there is a disparity between one group and another, you don't look at saying that's a characteristic of the group. You have to look further and say what's causing that disparity. And the disparity will come from policies and ideas, not from the people. And so I always come back to, when we're talking about disparities, why the death disparity, where we hear about comorbidity that's going on in the population right now. It goes all the way back to questions of wealth, questions about culture, employment, education, housing, and ultimately works up to medical care. Very quickly, if we're going to talk about the beginning of this, it all goes back to the whole issue about people being kidnapped and enslaved in this country, and the country being built on that. That's still important because between 1820 and 1860, the United States saw the fastest growth of GDP any country had ever seen in the world. And 40% of that GDP growth was from African Americans who were enslaved. They were never compensated for that. And it was like, okay, now you're free and you're out there, but wait a minute, there's no wealth that went along with that. As a result, right now, if we talk about Black wealth, white wealth is 86 times the wealth of Black people. It's 68 times the wealth of Latinx folks. If we go to employment, because that wealth isn't there, the education wasn't there because of segregation that went on afterwards from a policy point of view, legal segregation in the South, de facto segregation in the North. If we talk about the Ivy Leagues, even as late as the early 70s, I'll take an example of Brown University. The class of 1970 was 10 African Americans out of about 1,000 people. And the de facto segregation and its vestiges continued well into the 20th century for education. That's not to mention what went on in our public schools from K through 12. From a housing point of view, there was not just what went on during Jim Crow, but in the 1930s, once the federal government got into federal housing and the work with sponsoring loans, Black people were redlined out of that. Black communities were redlined out. So there was a lost opportunity for additional wealth, additional connections, a better education in terms of schooling, connections in order to get hired, that just didn't happen. Again, that's a policy that happened that led to people being put into, quote, ghettos. And for the first time, ghettos began to have a negative connotation with respect to the word's usage and a Black connotation of the country. And then you put all that together, and the hospitals in those communities that had been marginalized as Black and brown tended to be the ones that are considered, even today, the lower caliber hospitals. They don't have the doctors. Maybe the doctors and the medical teams are good, but the facilities are not there. Maternity wards are being closed down. Other kinds of facilities are not taking place there. That's one side of it. Doctors talk about comorbidity or pre-existing conditions like diabetes, heart problems, being overweight at the same time, and issues like that. But part of the issue is that the doctors are also not seeing patients of color the same way they see white patients. They're not prescribing the same caliber of remedies. And you hear over and over again about paramedics and doctors talking to some of the Black patients and saying, you'll be fine, go back home. People having to go 3 times in order to be admitted. And then in many cases, it's too late. So the bottom line here that I'm going to kick off is just in terms of a remedy for all of this, the idea is to go look at policies, not just the symptoms. And if you get back to what Jill was talking about earlier, which is this whole attitude, the policy is that everybody is supposed to be social distancing in New York, but the policy is implemented unevenly in some communities versus others. Nobody is going to be taken down and beaten if they live on Fifth Avenue in mid-Manhattan, unless they happen to be of a certain color. So if you look at the policies and you focus on that, you can get to the remedy for some of these things. I'll just throw that out for everybody to react to.
Harold, I actually have a question, and Maggie, then I'm just going to jump to you. Like when Jill was talking, so she knows these things. Since learning about the disparities and who is being checked and not checked in terms of social distancing, then she sees a police officer, right? And then has instead of thanking him or her, doesn't. I do like when she said it's both racist and anti-racist, right? I mean, so she's, what would Kendi say to that? Because actually he was challenging the idea that if any of us make assumptions, right? And stereotype anybody based on sort of race, then we need to check that.
Yeah.
Well, I think, okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that the same thing. What occurred to me was I feel like Kendi would say those police officers are themselves the victim of the policies that they are being asked to enforce. Policies that are from this very long history of inequity that Harold just gave us the tip of the iceberg statistics on. So, I mean, I think that that's what he would say. I feel like he would say that by feeling that you have to not thank them or step back from them is not actually anti-racist, right? Because what you're doing is potentially putting all police officers or all law enforcement in that same bucket that we say all white people, all black people, all brown people, when A, they're individuals. There's nothing inherent about them that makes them enact or behave the way they do. And secondarily, they're enacting policies that were handed to them.
But I think it also say at the same time, there is a problem with those policies.
Yeah.
In the sense that part of the nuance of the policy is we're not going to do it the same way in certain neighborhoods as we are in others. And so there's an inequity there. And that's what ought to go to be attacked.
Right.
And in the sense that you are having a reaction of not saying something because of that policy, I don't think I'm not, technically it would be part of the, as Ramin said, you'd be grouping people, assuming they're part of the same group. They're going to do those same things. But there is a problem with the policy, and I think his focus would be let's go look at that and let's react.
Right. So I mean, the reason I stopped thanking them is because I became the racist. Like, I became the one who's like, I'm going to discriminate against you because of what you do and again, I didn't read the book, but I'm going to discriminate against all police officers regardless of anything else about you, whatever, like you, brown hair, black hair, blonde hair, black, I mean, because some of these cops are black, but I stopped speaking to black, white, Hispanic. I'm not talking to any of you. And that's a racist because it's grouping them together and saying, because of what you've done to other black people, and since I'm black, I can no longer speak to you. And then the anti-racist is like, when I saw them and I don't care whether you're black or white or yellow, the cops, oh my God, thank you, you know? I don't know if that sort of
I don't think
confuses it or.
Joe, I think he would say that your energy is misdirected as far as being racist or anti-racist. In the sense that what really matters is not the individual, it's not the people, it's not whether these are good cops or not. It's are you folk? What are you doing to go after that policy? Are you doing anything to work with groups that are going to go after that policy? They're going to protest the policy. They're going to try to get it corrected. And so
I see you're saying it's the policy. It's not the individual. It's not about the individual. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Harold, do you have another question that you want to pose, or do we move on to Bernstein?
I think Bernstein right now. We've had taken up some time.
Okay, great. So Bernstein, if you want to pose your question.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. One of the questions that Kendi pursues throughout the book, I mean, there's so many, and he just weaves everything together so well, is he states the only way to undo racism is to constantly identify it, thank you, and then dismantle it. And just a few thoughts, and then of course I'm anxious to hear other thoughts. He does a lot of comparing to his own life, so I'll do that as well, and then try to relate it to the town we live in, Westport, which is what hit me as I was going through this and reflecting upon this question. Bottom line, ideally, we should all want to achieve a society with no racial inequities, which means that we must institute anti-racist policies, and we just talked about policies, to lead to anti-racist ideas. And he's very clear and consistent in all of his writing that ideas actually come from anti-racist policies or racist policies, and not the reverse. However, we have to get to the point where we see racism and then shine a light on that racism in order to dismantle it. Otherwise, we as a society will continue to be oblivious, and racial inequities will continue to exist and perpetuate. This is an important message for all people, Black, white, of color, whatever. However, I would say that it is extremely important for white people to sound the clarion call, since racism renders a call out from a person of color to be shrill, or we're playing the race card, or it can't be fact-based, and therefore it is not legitimate and not actionable. And we hear that all the time, being people of color. And a perfect example is the exposure of inequities during this pandemic that Harold talked about just before, in health, financial, employment, education, housing, etc. Who really paid a lot of attention to hearing about them before now? I mean, they were there all along. Now we're being made very much aware of inequities that have existed all along, but I fear that these inequities will have been heard, but will actually not be addressed and will fade into oblivion once we move on and open up. The one hope is that groups, and Reverend Allison sent a letter that the UCC has written highlighting this issue. So we're hoping that groups will keep ringing that bell and work on policy to dismantle some of these inequities. They're so deeply ingrained and they're not easy to wipe out, but we have to start somewhere. It's good the conversations have begun, and we definitely need more anti-racist action. Using the polar opposites of racist and anti-racist, the definitions of which we just discussed, we should all want to be anti-racist if we believe in equity and have respect for all groups. For to do otherwise would prolong racist policies and ideas, prolong a racist hierarchical power structure, and racist inequities, to name a few of the indications of racism. So we should all respect every group for what they are and what they bring to the table, even though the groups may be different from our own by way of culture, color, class, gender, etc. We should not generalize and say that everyone in a particular group, however the groups intersect, and we can talk about intersectionalities at some point, is the same based upon an experience we may have had or have seen with an individual member of a group. I look at what Kendi writes very early in the book as he's defining racist and anti-racist. And again, he says the only way to undo racism is to constantly identify it and describe it and then dismantle it. And I know, Robie, you were kind of, your example brought up, okay, I see it, I'm describing it, how do I dismantle it safely? And I see that as being a mantra for Team Westport and to what we've been trying to do over the past 18 years here in Westport. We are still, and I think we'll constantly be in the stage of trying to call out racism when we see it. It's a very difficult task, since most people who consider themselves racist, not knowing that saying they are colorblind, or that ensuring that everyone with whom they socialize is white, or that only attending white productions at the Playhouse, or assuming everyone of color they see is subservient to them, or in current situations, Asian people are responsible for the virus, or our schools in our town are perfect. These are just few examples. These all signal that they are racist and do not respect anything that is not considered white. Of course, this is consistent with people having racist ideas and actions while having anti-racist ideas and actions at the same time, as Kendi describes. Also, this is consistent with calling out racism to help people become aware of racism without being attacked personally. We aren't in the game of trying to do that either. We're just trying to garner understanding and realization of what's going on. Now, being of color in America, you absorb racism, meaning you see it, you feel it, and you react to it. And you may tend to be suspicious of what is genuine and what is not when listening or speaking with a white person. Kendi's work in this case, this book is really an autobiography tied in to his evolution while discussing racism versus anti-racism. But tying it to myself, my formative years were, and looking at what he says, it reminds me very much of what he says about his neighborhoods. My formative years were in very supportive Black inner city neighborhood in Washington, D.C., in a house with a front yard, a backyard. We were near schools and services, near churches, stores, including a supermarket, and, you know, small convenience stores as well. I attended a Black church. I attended Black schools with Black teachers. We saw people who were white only on TV, and if we went to downtown DC or, you know, walked around to the Capitol or whatever. But we had little to no interaction with people who were white when we were growing up. It was a Black community in DC with people of all different strata living together, although people who were not Black might incorrectly, negatively characterize that neighborhood as a ghetto, with a negative connotation ascribed to that word now, as Kendi wrote and Harold referred to earlier. So at that point, during my early development, there was much to build us up because we were surrounded by Black people and it was a positive environment. The second phase of my life, if I look at it that way, in two phases, was my going to college. And from that first year of college on, my life, I've been spending it in primarily white communities. Some in very, near very major cities like Boston and Dallas. So it's been during this time that I have felt racism, not before. And it started with my going away to college when I started interacting with people who were white. I continue to see racism in the experiences of our children and their children who have grown up in white communities and who continue to live in primarily white communities now, which has, and this experience has kind of countered the first part of my life where it was being built up, and now I really, you know, the whole second phase, I've been able to really see racism. So I can see it, but then it gets to how do you address it and how do you dismantle it. So again, we've been working with Team Westport, and all of us must have the proactive intent, and we must put in the effort to wipe out the poison of racism and to embrace and institute the ideal anti-racist policies that lead to a just and equitable society in Professor Kendi's terminology. So we need people on board to help in that effort. So those are my comments. I'm anxious to hear other thoughts. And I'll mute.
Does anyone have a question or a response or a reflection?
I'm so grateful for your ability to share your experience with your impressions of the book and the way that you do. It impresses upon, I have a lot of respect for how you phrase things and the message that I get from you, so thank you. And even that it's an ongoing struggle and that's okay. Doesn't negate, you know.
Yeah, but again, I welcome your beginning to see or thinking of things in terms of
just,
which you may not have before.
No, and my first foray into saying something in a way that felt like a just outright failure was with Staples High School. That's how I ended up finding you guys. And I still feel like that's a failure. And thanks to COVID, who knows? But yeah, I'll figure out a little bit at a time. I'll take it 10 minutes at a time, you know?
So a question from Zoe.
Well, I think what this brings up, and Bernstein brought up, is like that question that we're trying to tackle with Team Westport, which is how can we take anti-racist actions in a community that is primarily white, like where most of us, I don't know where everybody on this book group is from, but I see many faces from Westport, and I feel like that's the challenge before us. And I think that when Kendi has spoken to us, he has posed that very question. And I'd love to hear from others how they think they could enact anti-racist actions here in this community or communities like ours.
Can I share?
Please, please.
Hi, I'm actually a teacher in Westport. Before we left on March 11th, I had been working with a psychologist on some racist behavior that students were exhibiting, whether it was making slanted eyes towards Chinese children or saying that it's their fault, or saying the N-word in class. So the teachers were very concerned, and they wanted to address it, which is, I think, the first step in helping children to see the importance of respecting others. And so we worked together and used several different books that had Black or brown protagonists, and they were young. So like Ruby Bridges, we read that and talked about just really naming and narrating race and the race relations within that book. And I think coming out of all of that, I really feel like everyone needs to have the language about how to discuss this, because for as long as I've grown up, race is not something that is spoken about. And so when racial issues do come up, it's really hard to talk about them. So we made it a point that, I'm Black, the psychologist is white. We made sure that we, talked about our identity and shared that. And then also when the students were, and the kids really actually did have some language, but also some misconceptions. And so it was a great opportunity to talk about those misconceptions. Like when we looked at the story of Ruby Bridges, it's basically Ruby pushing a door open to the school and an angry white mob in the background. And when we talked about that, one of the kids said, well, the Americans look angry. And I thought that was interesting, because I was like, what do you mean? We're all American. They're all American in this story. And, so even there, like even using terms like African-American versus Black, I prefer Black. Everybody's American if you're living here. And yeah, I don't know. So, I think being able to talk about it as young as possible is important, and not talking about just negative racist things, but just talking about race in a beautiful way. If you, with everything that has been going on, I do a lot of writing, and the last thing that I wrote was about, basically we're taught to hate everything Black. And even in Kendi's, the beginning of his book, where he calls himself a racist, I think we're all racist because we have been taught to hate Black or not have a conversation about it. For example, I come from a family of, it's multiracial. I have Black, white, Colombian everything in my family. And I have two brothers that have the same name. One of them's black, one of them's white. And when people would call and we'd say, oh, which one do you want to talk to? They would whisper the word black, but proudly say the word white. So it's, I think, you know, some of that is the anti-racist work is seeing everything, seeing differences as assets, not deficits. And I think that's all I'm going to say. I could go on and on. I'm sorry. But
Thank you.
There.
Thank you. Thank you.
By the way, Faith, what grade range were you talking about?
That happened to be 3rd grade.
Wow.
So, and I did an implicit bias workshop a couple years ago for teachers, and the film, I showed a film, it was of Asian Americans, because I feel like the population of Asian Americans is high in Westport, and just showing like the impressions. And one of the speakers on there said that, you know, he had this crush on this girl when he was in kindergarten, and the girl turned to him and said, "Ew, you're the color of poop." So it starts as early as that. And I know that Robie had mentioned something about the high school. I think it has to begin well before high school.
Thanks.
Absolutely. I'm going to move this along to Ramin, if you can have a few reflections and some questions possibly to ask.
Sure. So what I want to talk about is, I'll read it to you. Kendi thinks we should assess candidates as being racist or anti-racist based on what ideas they're expressing and what policies they're supporting, and not what they say is in their bones or their hearts. Do you agree with him? Why or why not? So I wanted to talk about this for a number of reasons. We're in an election year, a highly contentious election year. So this idea of what, it's that simple idea, what you say and what you do, right? So for me, I started thinking about this in the context of how Kendi framed it in 2 ways, as a person and as a historian, right? Because I am a historian and I'm a journalist and I'm a person first. And so in personhood, I often err to the side of, you know, your actions speak for you, and you must be taken into account for your actions, good and bad, even if the bad comes from a place of unwitting badness, because only by sort of having reprobation do you learn, oh, that was bad, I shouldn't do it again, even though I didn't mean it. So that's how I came to it, right? As a historian, it's interesting. It made me realize reading this that how I think about it as a person and how I let myself think about it as a historian is different, because as historians, when we look at policies over time, over history, it's often all we have to understand the expression of ideas. So we spend a lot of time looking at a policy as an expression of an idea, and then trying to unpack the emotion behind it. Why did they do it? What does that say about them as a person, right? And so when I think about this, I think about what I was doing there, or what historians often do, is to almost sort of justify certain policies by going to the place of, but what did they really mean? When really what we should be doing, the most objective sense, when we do our jobs right, is to say, this is a policy that they engaged in. It created inequity. It created issues. What can be done to dismantle it? Kendi talks about assessing, he says, what if we assess methods and leaders by the results of the policy and of policy change and equity? In other words, how good are you on this policy change and equity? Let's judge you by that success versus the sort of baseline of the failure of not of engaging in the same policies. I want to just give you a couple of examples, and then I really want to know what people think about this. I think about my own work. You know, for 10 years, I've spent a lot of time researching, as a lot of people here know, George Washington and his enslaved people. And at some point during this research, something became really apparent that often in my talks, I would say I'd give him credit for, and then reading Kendi makes me feel like I'm not going to do that anymore. And that is, during his lifetime, Washington actually started to evolve his own idea of slavery. He started to privately have discussions with himself and with his personal secretary that it was wrong, but he also said he didn't know how to solve it. Privately, he started to put in policies in his private life to address this inequity in his plantation, freeing the people that he personally owned, providing money for their education. So again, it's not like you're free, you're out in the world. Now what do you do, as Kendi said, but trying to set them up in some way. But he did not change the national policy, right? So now thinking about Kendi, I think about, okay, so Washington, you took this small step toward changing policy, but it wasn't the kind of policy change that really created equity in the large scale. And if we judge you by that, as he's suggesting, you failed, right? You are not a proper candidate for us. I think when we think about policies, we have to think about how they're enacted, because policies are subtle enough, usually, to allow enactment to be very personal, like police officers, right? Here's the policy, it's social distancing. How is it enacted on Fifth Avenue? How is it enacted in Morningside Park? Totally different, right? So then we need to assess, in my opinion, the individual at that level as well. The policy too, but the individual, you know, the gaps in the policy that allow the individual to even unwittingly operate from their racist behaviors in the policy enactment. And the last thing I'll say, and it goes back to a lot of what we've been saying and a lot of what Faith said about language, and then I think that when we assess candidates and politicians for their ability, based on their enactment of policy, the policy they stand for, the policy that they work toward equity versus what they say they believe, I think we need to think about their language. And I think language is incredibly important, because the subtlety of language is a clue as to the ability to enact equitable policies. And so just some examples that I come across in my work as a historian, often correcting people that do not refer to people as slaves, refer to them as enslaved people. This was an action that was done to them that started a path of inequity. You know, even words like equity versus equality. And when you talk about equality in this way, it almost implies that, you know, something given that some people innately have and some people are striving toward, when in fact, it is innate to all of us. Equity is where the difference is. So let's talk about equity. And then even terms like, you know, I often admonish my staff, we talk about people being under-resourced, meaning that they do not have access or they've been denied access to resources that should be their due, versus low income or underserved, which implies almost a paternalism, right? Or urban, that's the other clue. So the other kind of code word. So when I think about this, and when he says this, you know, and there's another line I'll just read to you, he says, when the politician we supported does not change racist policy, we blame the intractability of racism rather than our support of the wrong politician. And I think that for a lot of us, a lot of people of color, we have this sort of terrible, I know I do, internal dilemma with President Obama, who, you know, I love in many ways, but when I'm really honest with myself, I have to say, you know, did he truly, you know, enact policies to change racist policy across the board? And I can't say that he did across the board, but then I must take myself to task for kind of blindly continuing to support, you know, him at all costs, right? So that's my thought. I would love anyone else's thoughts on that idea, especially since we are in an election year.
please just unmute yourself and answer, or if you have another question you'd like to ask.
I'd like to chime in. Raman mentioned Obama, and I always point out to people that Obama's presidency was an 8-year exercise in white fragility. It was his job to be the figurehead black president, first black president, and still not piss white people off too much. His first job was to not piss white people off too much, because white is still the powers that be. And it was the biggest example of that was the Harvard professor guy who got arrested in his home.
Escapes.
Yeah. I tell people the president of this country had to bow down to a fucking white beat cop. That's how powerful white is in this country. Mm-hmm. And that was his first task, was to bow down to this freaking beat cop. I knew that going in. I knew that when he was elected. I knew that's how it was gonna go. And I am a person that sees life in long, they say the arc of justice bends towards peace. It's a long arc. And I felt like if Obama did 1 or 2 good things to help that arc along in the right direction, then he did as much as he could.
Listen, don't get me wrong. I love President Obama, and I agree with you. I'm thinking about it in terms of Kendi. Like, what would Kendi say? Like, in the context of this book, he's really rigorous about telling us, look at yourself, look at yourself, look at yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And admit when, like, I think he might say to us, I can't speak for him, when we say, and I'm given to saying that too, what could he do? The system is stacked against him, no doubt, right? What would Kendi say to that? And I think he might say, that's true. All of that is true. But let's now look at the actuality of what can be changed. What's in our like, I know in myself and my family, I mean, I'll be honest, we take the tack of a lot of people of color that you can say no wrong about President Obama. Like, just stop talking. Stop, right? But if I read this book and I think, if I have to be critical and think critically, are there places where perhaps he could have tried to undo policy given his position? So I don't disagree with you. I totally get what you're saying.
And I'm not here to, like, Obama's, the best thing since sliced bread. He was. That's another story. But what I'm really speaking to is the power of white power in this country. And it frustrates me because Ibram's other book, Stamped from the Beginning, had a much bigger impression on me. If any of you haven't read that book, I'm telling you, read that one and you're done. You're done. It's that good. And where was I going with this? We're talking about racist power and racist policies. When I hear about things that happened in the past, for example, Ruby, Faith was mentioning Ruby earlier. We study these people and we talk about how they overcame such obstacles, and Dr. Martin Luther King, how they overcame such obstacles and how they were so patient and this and that and this and that. But what we need to take a bigger and a good look at is the obstacles that they needed to overcome. Mm-hmm. We look at Ruby Bridges, we say, oh, she was so brave, but white America won't look at itself and say, okay, in the 1960s, this is who we were. we were intimidating a little girl for the sake of white power. You know, white won't look at itself and say, you know, we were so threatened by the idea of Black people getting their comeuppance in '68 that a man had to die. You know, and that's what we need. That's what we need to be looking at. That's what we need to be looking at really hard, I feel, and we just don't.
Can I respond to that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then we're going to move to Alison for.
Yes.
But please do respond, Faith.
Just so the depth of the conversation does talk about perspectives of both of the Black and white in the book. So we do get to, you know, why do you think white people feel this way about Black people? Why do you think they're feeling this way towards Ruby? And getting the kids to articulate that. And then that's where we're learning where the misconceptions are in their understanding and talking it out so they get a deeper understanding of what, you know, what went on during that time period without, you know, I mean.
It's a wonderful thing getting them started on that conversation that early.
You have to. I mean, they're seeing so many mixed messages everywhere that and if opportunity arises, you have to do it. I mean, I wish there was a better way and not being reactionary, but that's what, you know, that's what came out of that. But proactive is.
I'm going to throw in one more story. I'm going to throw in one more story. Then I cede to Alison. We're talking about kids, and you know how a lot of people think, you know, kids aren't, you know, kids don't see these things, or kids are pure and they're innocent, so on, and they pick it up pretty early. So that really speaks to how strong it is, because I imagine nobody, you know, at 3 years old, when you're not even fully verbal, you have already picked up that Black is lesser than white. And I have an example. I'm in Buffalo, New York, and we are 5 minutes away from the Peace Bridge, where you can go over to the Canadian side of the falls. And me and a white girlfriend of mine were walking around the touristy part of Niagara Falls one summer day. And she had 2 kids. She was carrying the baby with her, and I was walking around with the 3-year-old. And he could feel, people weren't like just, you know, but he could feel people kind of looking over at us like, is that her child? You know, what white man debased himself to have a child with her? He was feeling that at 3 years old. So just to be a smarty pants, he looked at me and he went, "Mommy, 3 years old." 3 years old, he picked up on that. So, so all these people who want to say, you know, white fragility, white supremacy isn't real, and here are the facts. I have no time for them. Yeah. And again, the
messages start young, right? I mean, that is why some of the movement, we're trying to figure out how to shift a lot of things in the Westport School District. Just how are we educating our young children and giving them, Faith, to your point earlier, vocabulary. So Alison, why don't we move to you as we wind down?
Thanks. Nanette, this is actually was a great segue. I do want to just reach back to Bernstein's reflection for a moment and pull from it one really early key idea, that sort of premise that Dr. Kendi offers up, that I think is our fundamental challenge, and it challenges us differently if we're white or brown or Black. But I just wanted to name it out loud, because Dr. Kendi suggests that we need to think of the term racist as a description and not as slander, right? Because when we think of the word racist as an insult, it shuts down the conversation. And speaking of white fragility, it's often white folks who are resistant to contemplating how we have been racist. I really appreciate how my colleagues have been reflecting tonight on the different ways that we all behave in ways that are both racist and then on our good days anti-racist. But that single challenge, that we shift our thinking so that we can use the word racist as a description that just names a fact. You know, that behavior, that comment, that policy is racist. Now let's unpack what we can do about it, as Bernstein outlined, is for me just a really valuable starting place for this conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about fear, and the conversations that have come before and some of the stories that have just been shared set me up for this really nicely. Dr. Kendi describes being raised to fear Black bodies, even his own. I believed that violence defined me, that I should fear all darkness up to and including my own Black body. He says this is in the chapter on racism and bodies. He notes that fear is rooted not in any kind of reality that is borne out by research, but rather is rooted in racist policies promoted by those in power, racist assertions built into crime bills, and stories that single out violent Black bodies instead of the overwhelming majority of nonviolent Black bodies. He comments at one point, those crime bills have never correlated to crime any more than fear has correlated to actual violence. And that line struck me, that fear is not correlated with actual violence. I think we need to live with that claim, to really lean into it and contemplate it, how it indicts us some days. So this week I'm thinking of Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot and killed because Black bodies have been so thoroughly demonized that a 25-year-old man out for a morning jog, something that would be so ordinary as to go unnoticed if the runner was a white man, could be chased down and shot dead. And as much as I'd like to single out the two men who committed that homicide in one devastating racist act, Kendi reminds us that behind those men stands an entire justice system that assumes that Black bodies are a threat and guilty until proven innocent. It's important, I think, to make the distinction between the individual acts of those two men, which, let me be clear, deserve to be called out and they deserve to be held accountable. But when I stop there, when I point my finger and say those are racist men who committed that act because they only see in a Black body a threat, when I stop there, I fail to name the fact that I am, in fact, some way a participant in the policies that allow that kind of act first to occur and then to go prosecuted for several months. So I am, and we are all indicted by those racist acts when we frame this in terms of the policies which have perpetuated the fear. So that's all according to Kendi, right? This is what Dr. Kendi, the shift that Dr. Kendi invites us to, been lifted up in a variety of ways tonight. So all of that prompts me to ask, how do I and how do we collectively pay attention to, unpack, and appropriately locate our own fears, our own assumptions about what is actually dangerous? Individually, it's good to do that work, but I'm also talking about in terms of the policies that we develop. How do we scrutinize our fears and gut check our policies to expose underlying assumptions that have no bearing in reality, but instead have been fears that have been constructed over time? I don't have an answer to the question that I'm posing, but the invitation that I hear Kendi extending is an invitation to pay attention to the fear when we feel it in our bodies, when we notice it informing the decisions that we make in our own lives, whether we cross the street, when we lock a car door, when we change aisles in a store, whether or not we greet that police officer, but also when we decide how we're going to behave as organizations, what it means to be welcoming or not welcoming, how we evaluate who should be allowed in the door, what feels safe, what it means for us to make our decisions based on our gut. You know, often we talk about responding to a situation by instinct, and the fact is we can't always trust our instincts. We can't always trust our gut, given the degree to which we have been taught to irrationally fear when there's not cause for fear. So what I'm looking for are allies who help to call me out and with whom I can do my own gut checking and say, you know, if I'm feeling fear, is this real fear, or is this something that I need to peel away? And I'm looking for ways to dig into the policies and the practices in our organizations and say, you know, on what basis are we establishing these policies? And if it's rooted in fear, what's the nature of that fear? I would love to hear any comments about how you wrestle with your own fears, when they get stirred up, how you recognize them, or when you have been the target of somebody else's irrational fear as well. Thank you. I realize fear is kind of a deep emotional place to end up after, you know, almost an hour and a half of conversation. So I'm not necessarily looking for deep confessions about the things that keep us up at night. But I do think that that part of what I'm wrestling with is how we actually sometimes move out of that emotional space, and how do we shine a light on the stuff that we think is a problem, and expose the fact that there's no problem here. This is not the risk that we've been taught to fear.
Does it have to be as intense as fear? Could it be just implicit bias as well?
Absolutely. Well, the way that I listen to Dr. Kendi talk about, particularly in the chapter about bodies and what we have been taught to think about it when we regard brown and black bodies, I think that fear may be the emotional. This is like a chicken and egg question, right? Faith, it's which comes first, the implicit bias or the fear? What I know is that when I, in my life, have reacted without thinking, crossing a street because I feel nervous, right? That's not frontal cortex thinking. That's something implicit, but the behavior is a fear reaction, right? That's the expression that comes with the implicit bias. I do, you know, and I'm using a personal, you know, an individual example when I talk about crossing the street, but I really am interested in Kendi's challenge that we think about this in terms of our policies and practices. So I'm the pastor of a church. So we talk about what it means to have a community that is wide open and welcoming. And as we define the policies and practices that go along with being welcoming, if someone says, well, what happens if a homeless person comes in the door? How do we react? Thinking about whether we have built policies that have racist assumptions as their underpinnings, right? As opposed to anti-racist assumptions. That's the work we need to do as organizations, not just as individuals. And that's the piece that I'm really interested in, is when are our policies informed by fear rather than by the kind of anti-racist position that Kendi's calling us to.
Mm-hmm. So we could certainly open this up for much more conversation, but it is almost 8:30, so we're going to wind down. And I just wanted to give a little information that we would love to hear. If anybody wants to write in the chat any of their suggestions about books that they might like to have discussed in this forum, you know, in the next couple months, please let us know. We're always looking for recommendations. And you can find Team Westport on Facebook, Team Westport, Westport, Connecticut. If you want to email Team Westport directly, you can email info@teamwestport.org, and you can find the website at teamwestport.org. So we're pretty easy to find, and we're really happy that you all joined us, and we hope to do this again. I'm already seeing some answers in the chat, so please give us suggestions for books, and we hope to see you both, you know, possibly online, but in person at some point in the future. Harold, do you have anything? Yeah, please.
Just one other thing, and that's that we can also do, we're looking at pioneering kind of offshoot discussions. If you want to go further in talking about this particular book and are interested in a follow-on discussion, send that along in the chat as well, because we want to see if we can now start to have the equivalent of breakout groups that go into detail, maybe in a particular aspect of what we talked about today.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so good night, everyone. Take care, be well, and hope to see you again.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.